So nigga Boosie killed 9 people, went to trial for 5. Used a 16-year-old to kill 5 people, and this kid didn't make over $50,000. He paid $2,000 per hit. And people saying God on his side. You're a damn lie when he got a 15-year-old doing life in prison. And by the way, I helped work on that law to try to get this kid out. It's called JLWOP, juvenile life without parole. I went to Washington, D.C. over 4 or 5 times. We got it abolished, but you know what? They didn't make it retroactive for the boy Boosie used. So that's why this is personal to me, nigga.
Boo's 15-year-old hitman. The same teenager prosecutors say allegedly handled the most violent work on his behalf. The same young boy they claim was tied to 9 bodies before he was even old enough to legally sit behind a steering wheel is now attempting to cooperate in hopes of reducing his sentence. That detail alone shifts the entire atmosphere surrounding this case. For years, there was silence. For years, there was finality. He accepted life without parole while others walked free, and the public assumed the story had settled into history. Now that assumption no longer feels secure. Marlo Mike is reportedly prepared to talk if it means even the slightest chance at daylight again. And if that cooperation gains traction, the foundation of everything people believed about the Boo case could begin to fracture. Not loudly at first, but slowly, structurally, in ways no one expected. To understand how it reached this point requires stepping backward. This story does not begin with a courtroom. It begins in Baton Rouge, inside an environment that shaped young lives long before headlines ever did. Marlo Mike was not a veteran street figure when his name first surfaced. He was not a seasoned enforcer with a long criminal resume. He was 15 years old, from a city where street politics were already escalating beyond control. His government name was Michael Ling, but in the streets he was known as Marlo Mike. That distinction matters because reputation in that environment carried weight long before legal records ever did. Before his association with Bowie, he was simply another teenager navigating survival in a place that offered very few safe exits. Baton Rouge in the mid-2000s was volatile. Different sets were locked in tension. The drug economy was expanding. Violence was not random. It followed territory lines. It followed reputation disputes. It followed long memories. Conflicts built over time and then erupted without warning. Artists like Boosie and Webby were putting the city on the national map. Fame elevated the music scene, but it also intensified rivalries. Success in rap did not always mean separation from the streets. In many cases, it amplified visibility. And when visibility increases, so do threats. Enemies emerge. Positions are challenged. Protection becomes more than a luxury. It becomes strategy. By 2005 and 2006, Boosie was rising quickly through Trill Entertainment. Records like Zoom and Wipe Me Down were moving through clubs, radio rotations, and neighborhood speakers across the South. On the surface, it looked like pure upward momentum, a city star breaking through. But prosecutors would later argue there was more happening beneath that surface. Behind the scenes, allegations pointed toward street operations running parallel to the music, drug money, territory disputes, ongoing conflicts that required more than hired security in suits. If someone believed they were operating inside that world, they would not rely on conventional protection. They would rely on individuals who understood the rules of that environment, people who could move without drawing attention, people who already knew how the streets functioned. That is where Marlo Mike enters the picture. What often gets overlooked is that he was still a minor. He was not fully formed. He was impressionable. A young person growing up in a city where local rap stars represented both survival and status. For a teenager in that position, proximity to someone successful could feel like opportunity, validation, belonging. It could feel like stepping into a different future. When a powerful figure takes you under their wing, loyalty can become absolute, especially when that loyalty is tied to reputation and identity. In environments like that, lines blur quickly. What begins as admiration can turn into obligation, and obligation, over time, becomes action. The numbers attached to his name are what made this case so explosive. Not one alleged killing. Not 2. Prosecutors connected Marlo Mike to 9 murders before he reached adulthood. 9 separate accusations attached to someone who, legally, was still a child. That contrast is what made the case impossible to ignore. It was not just about violence, it was about scale. It was about age. And it was about the possibility that a teenager had become central to a larger system most people only saw from a distance. 9 at 15 years old. He could not vote. He could not sign a lease. He could not legally purchase basic adult commodities. Yet authorities described him as operating with the precision of someone far older. That contrast became one of the most disturbing elements in the entire narrative. A teenager by law, but, according to prosecutors, moving with the calculation of a trained adult. The most controversial detail in the allegations was the reported payment. Investigators claimed he was paid approximately $2,000 per hit. If true, that figure reframes everything. It suggests that a teenager's life, and the lives of others, were reduced to a transaction amount that would not even cover a modest used vehicle. That number became central to how the public processed the story. It turned something already shocking into something transactional, clinical, measurable. Years later, with a life sentence already in place, the possibility that Marlo Mike is reconsidering his silence introduces a new variable. Cooperation in cases like this does not just affect one person. It can reopen conversations many believed were sealed permanently. It can redirect scrutiny. It can shift narratives that had settled into accepted history. That is where the tension begins to build again. 2,000. That was the number attached to each allegation. Put that into perspective carefully. During that same era, artists were spending more than that in a single night on jewelry, bottles, and outfits designed for visibility. Displays of success were public and loud. Yet prosecutors argued that a teenager's involvement in homicide was being valued at $2,000 per incident. The contrast was impossible to ignore. When you multiply that figure by 9, the total barely reaches $18,000. Not even $20,000. That amount would not secure experienced legal defense in a case of that magnitude. It would not buy insulation from the legal consequences that follow accusations of that scale. It would not purchase protection from federal attention. It would not erase exposure. The math does not equal the damage tied to those accusations. For a 15-year-old from Baton Rouge, however, $2,000 could feel enormous. It could mean new shoes, new clothes, status symbols that signal alignment and power. It could mean helping at home with rent or utilities in a neighborhood where resources are limited. Short-term gain can distort long-term risk, especially when long-term risk feels abstract and immediate reward feels real. What is rarely explained to someone that young is the cost attached to so-called blood money. The payment is immediate. The consequences are permanent. Every dollar earned through violence carries legal exposure and psychological weight that does not disappear with time. That weight accumulates quietly. It sits beneath the surface long after the transaction is complete. The city was not blind. Baton Rouge understood the tension building during those years. People talked quietly. Allegiances were known. The atmosphere was tense, but public silence dominated. The street code discouraged cooperation. Witnesses stayed distant. Conversations happened behind closed doors. It was widely believed that a young shooter was operating within certain circles. But belief is not evidence. And in that environment, evidence was difficult to secure. Authorities would later describe that teenager as someone involved in multiple targeted killings that reshaped rivalries across the city. These were not random acts. Prosecutors framed them as connected to disputes, debts, disrespect, and territorial lines that were already unstable. Each incident layered onto the next. Each allegation deepened the pattern investigators believed they were seeing. One of the most widely discussed incidents was the October 2009 killing of Terry Boyd. Prosecutors alleged that Marlo Mike was the triggerman. They further alleged that the act was ordered. That accusation became central to the broader case because it shifted the narrative from isolated violence to structured intent. It suggested hierarchy, direction, coordination. As the investigation widened, more names surfaced. More incidents were linked. The scale became difficult even for those accustomed to street violence to process. 9 alleged murders connected to someone who was still in high school. Someone who, on paper, should have been focused on exams and attendance records. Instead, according to the state, he was at the center of something far darker. And now, years later, the possibility of cooperation forces a re-examination of everything that followed. Because when someone positioned at the center of those allegations considers speaking, the silence that once protected others begins to feel fragile. That is not a statistic. These were people, lives, families. The question that lingers is not simply how it happened, but how it escalated without interruption. How does a teenager accumulate that level of alleged involvement without intervention? How does that pattern build, incident after incident, without someone stepping in? In environments where violence becomes normalized, warning signs often go unchallenged. They blend into the background. Loyalty overrides caution. Reputation overrides restraint. And youth becomes a tool rather than a protected stage of life. What receives less attention is the psychological burden tied to that trajectory. Even if someone appears hardened, even if they operate with discipline and detachment, the mind does not disconnect without consequence. A 15-year-old is still developing cognitively and emotionally. Neurological development continues well into early adulthood. Exposure to repeated violence during that stage can produce trauma responses that last for decades. Sleep disruption, intrusive memories, emotional instability. These are documented outcomes, not speculation. They are patterns observed repeatedly in environments shaped by conflict. While Busy was recording music, performing nationally, and building a public career, Marlo Mike was reportedly facing the aftermath. Internally, if the allegations are accurate, that would mean carrying the weight of 9 funerals, 9 grieving families, 9 irreversible outcomes. The public narrative often centers on street credibility, on reputation, on perceived strength. What it rarely addresses is the isolation that follows violent action, especially for someone that young. Adults who choose a street life, rightly or wrongly, make that decision with a fully developed brain. They can rationalize, they can compartmentalize, they can justify. A teenager does not possess the same neurological tools. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, is still forming. That difference matters. It shapes perception of risk. It affects understanding of permanence. It limits the ability to grasp how today's decision reshapes tomorrow's reality. When trauma compounds before maturity arrives, the consequences become both legal and psychological. As the years passed and the legal case solidified, that reality began to surface. Silence can hold only so long when the sentence is life without parole. When someone that young is left alone with decades of reflection ahead of them, perspective inevitably shifts. Time forces confrontation with memory. That shift is what makes the current reports of potential cooperation so significant. It suggests that the weight may have finally become heavier than the code that once kept him quiet. Every night becomes its own battlefield. When he closes his eyes, the memories do not fade. They intensify. Faces resurface. Gunshots echo. Moments replay without pause. There is no reset button. No escape from recall. There was no counselor, no structured intervention, no one publicly guiding him through what repeated exposure to violence does to a developing mind. Trauma does not disappear because someone appears composed in public. It accumulates quietly. It builds pressure beneath the surface. And over time, it destabilizes everything. There was no evidence that anyone sat him down and asked whether he was coping. No indication of sustained concern about psychological damage. Only a system that eventually responded once the damage had already been done. Instead, the pattern, according to prosecutors, was transactional. A target, an instruction, payment, move on. In that framework, Marlo Mike was not treated as a teenager navigating adolescence. He was described as an instrument, a means to an end, a tool operating within a structure larger than himself. And the most unsettling part is that he may not have recognized it at the time. When you are inside a system like that, roles do not always feel imposed. They feel earned. Loyalty can feel honorable when you are young. Proving yourself can feel necessary, especially when your identity becomes tied to someone you respect or admire. Approval carries weight. Validation feels like advancement. In that environment, obedience can feel like strength. Then something shifted. Not because he was cornered. Not because overwhelming evidence forced his hand. Not because someone else implicated him first. Marlo Mike walked into a police station and confessed. That decision did not align with street expectations. It defied the code that had governed silence. It disrupted the narrative of discipline and loyalty that often shields organized violence from exposure. The explanation that followed was not framed as strategic. It was psychological. The weight had become unbearable. Carrying 9 alleged killings internally had reached a breaking point. In that moment, relief outweighed reputation. He chose confession over concealment, even if it meant permanent incarceration. That choice alone altered how the case would unfold. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some labeled him a snitch. They argued the code is absolute. That loyalty requires silence regardless of outcome. From that perspective, confession is betrayal. It does not matter how young someone is or how heavy the burden becomes. Others saw something different. They saw a minor placed inside an adult conflict, a teenager navigating decisions with consequences far beyond his developmental capacity. They saw someone whose environment may have accelerated exposure without accelerating maturity. The debate exposed a deeper tension about accountability and influence. It forced uncomfortable conversations about who directs and who executes, about who benefits and who absorbs the consequences. The power dynamic cannot be ignored. At 15, cognitive maturity is incomplete. Impulse control, long-term forecasting, risk assessment, all still forming neurologically. Contrast that with an established adult figure with money, fame, and authority. When someone in that position gives direction, the imbalance is clear. Admiration can blur judgment. Validation can override hesitation. The teenager sees opportunity. He does not yet see inevitability. When the case advanced to trial, the disparity in outcomes became central to public perception. Boosie faced charges tied to 5 of the murders. Prosecutors framed the allegations as part of a broader criminal enterprise. They presented testimony, recordings, and circumstantial evidence intended to establish orchestration rather than coincidence. The argument was structured around coordination, not chaos. The defense countered aggressively. Reasonable doubt became the focal point. Each allegation was dissected. Each connection was challenged. The jury ultimately did not convict beyond that standard. And he walked free. From a legal standpoint, that is the system functioning as designed. The burden of proof rests with the state. If it is not met, acquittal follows. Marlo Mike's position was fundamentally different. He had already confessed. His admissions were documented. Although he was a juvenile at the time of the offenses, the court imposed life without the possibility of parole. No rehabilitation pathway, no second review, a sentence that effectively meant dying in custody. Psychological vulnerability, age, and alleged manipulation were acknowledged arguments, but they did not alter the ruling. The legal conclusion was absolute. He was sent to Angola State Penitentiary, one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in the United States. For a teenager who had once moved through Baton Rouge streets chasing validation and belonging, the destination became a facility built to contain the most serious offenders in the country. The contrast between where the story began and where it settled could not have been more severe. Instead, the pattern, according to prosecutors, was transactional. A target, an instruction, payment, move on. In that narrative, Marlo Mike was not treated as a teenager navigating adolescence. He was described as an instrument, a means to an end. The most unsettling part is that he may not have recognized it at the time. When you are young, loyalty can feel honorable. Proving yourself can feel necessary, especially when your identity becomes tied to someone you respect or admire. Admiration distorts scale. It narrows vision. It makes risk feel distant and validation feel immediate. Then something shifted. Not because he was cornered. Not because overwhelming evidence forced his hand. Not because someone else implicated him first. Marlo Mike walked into a police station and confessed. That decision did not align with street expectations. It defied the code that had governed silence. It disrupted assumptions about how someone in that position was supposed to act. The explanation that followed was not strategic. It was psychological. The weight had become unbearable. Carrying 9 alleged killings internally had reached a breaking point. In that moment, relief outweighed reputation. He chose confession over concealment, even if it meant permanent incarceration. That choice altered everything. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some labeled him a snitch. They argued the code is absolute. That loyalty requires silence regardless of outcome. Others saw something different. They saw a minor placed inside an adult conflict. A teenager navigating decisions with consequences far beyond his developmental capacity. The debate exposed a deeper tension about accountability and influence. The power dynamic cannot be ignored. At 15, cognitive maturity is incomplete. Impulse control, long-term forecasting, risk assessment are still forming neurologically. Contrast that with an established adult figure with money, fame, and authority. When someone in that position gives direction, the imbalance is clear. Admiration can blur judgment. Validation can override hesitation. The teenager sees opportunity. He does not yet see inevitability. When the case advanced to trial, the disparity in outcomes became central to public perception. Boosie faced charges tied to 5 of the murders. Prosecutors framed the allegations as part of a broader criminal enterprise. They presented testimony, recordings, and circumstantial evidence intended to establish orchestration. The defense countered aggressively. Reasonable doubt became the focal point. The jury ultimately did not convict beyond that standard, and he walked free. From a legal standpoint, that is the system functioning as designed. Marlo Mike's position was fundamentally different. He had already confessed. His admissions were documented. Although he was a juvenile at the time of the offenses, the court imposed life without the possibility of parole. No rehabilitation pathway. No second review. A sentence that effectively meant dying in custody. Psychological vulnerability, age, and alleged manipulation were acknowledged arguments, but they did not alter the ruling. The legal conclusion was absolute. He was sent to Angola State Penitentiary, one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in the United States. Angola is not symbolic. It is physically isolating and historically severe, especially for someone who entered the system as a minor. The environment magnifies consequence. Decades stretch ahead with limited relief. That is the context in which current reports of potential cooperation must be understood. When a life sentence becomes reality, silence transforms from loyalty into confinement without exit. Angola is called the farm for a reason. The prison sits on land that was once a slave plantation. To this day, inmates are assigned to field labor under conditions that many describe as frozen in another century. It is isolated. It is violent. It is a place Louisiana reserves for people it does not expect to release. By the time Marlo Mike was sentenced, he had just turned 16. A teenager was transferred into one of the harshest correctional environments in the country, with no scheduled exit date. That context matters. Age matters. Finality matters. From the outside, the contrast is stark. Boosie did not physically pull a trigger. He went to trial and was acquitted. Legally, that is the conclusion. He returned to recording music, hosting events, appearing on social media, rebuilding his career publicly. Meanwhile, Marlo Mike remained inside a maximum security facility carrying the consequences of his own admissions. Whether one views him as fully responsible or influenced, the outcome is undeniable. One moved forward in public life, the other entered permanent confinement. That distinction has fueled ongoing criticism. It represents the difference between alleged orchestration and direct action, between authority and obedience, between the one who issues instructions and the one who carries them out. In criminal enterprises, hierarchy often shields those at the top while exposing those at the bottom. That dynamic is not unique to this case, but here it became highly visible. Then Charleston White entered the discussion. Charleston is known for confrontational commentary, particularly when minors are involved in criminal systems. He began publicly advocating for Marlo Mike's release under broader juvenile justice reform efforts. The focal point became jail WAP, juvenile life without parole. The argument is rooted in neuroscience and constitutional law. Research confirms that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term decision-making, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. Based on that understanding, critics question whether a 15-year-old should receive the same irreversible sentence as a fully developed adult. As a 40-year-old, Charleston traveled to Washington, D.C. multiple times, reportedly meeting with lawmakers and organizations pushing for reform. The movement gained traction nationally. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Later decisions reinforced the principle that children are constitutionally different from adults for sentencing purposes. On paper, that was a shift. The complication is retroactivity. While the court limited mandatory juvenile life sentences, not every case was automatically reopened. That left individuals like Marlo Mike in a legal gray space, sentenced under one framework, watching reform unfold from behind bars. And now, with reports of potential cooperation surfacing, that unresolved tension is resurfacing again. Some states applied reforms unevenly. Individuals already serving life without parole often faced procedural barriers to relief that left people like Marlo Mike in legal limbo. The law evolved, but their sentences remained intact. New juvenile defendants might receive review hearings, individualized resentencing, or second-look provisions. Those already buried in the system largely remained where they were. The principle changed. The outcome did not. Charleston framed that disparity as injustice. He argued that influence and manipulation should be weighed more heavily than they often are in public conversation. He criticized Boosie publicly, asserting that adults who direct minors into violence bear greater moral responsibility. His language has been direct, uncompromising. He has said that Boosie benefited from distance. Distance from the trigger, distance from prison, distance from the psychological aftermath. Meanwhile, the teenager absorbed the full consequence. One of Charleston's repeated statements centered on sleep. He claimed Boo can rest because he did not physically carry out the acts, while the baby, as he described Marlo Mike, could not sleep because he had 9 bodies on his conscience. That framing is emotional, but it reflects the core of his argument. A child burdened by violence ultimately broke under its weight, confessed, and received a sentence with no exit. Meanwhile, the adult figure alleged to have ordered violence resumed public life after acquittal. Whether one agrees with Charleston's tone or not, his involvement kept the case in public conversation. It forced renewed examination of juvenile sentencing, influence, and accountability. He consistently returned to the imbalance, not simply who committed the act, but who shaped the environment in which the act occurred. Not simply who confessed, but who moved forward. Now, with reports suggesting Marlo Mike may be reconsidering his silence in exchange for a potential second chance, those unresolved tensions are resurfacing again. Because if cooperation occurs, it would not just revisit old allegations. It would test whether the system that once closed this chapter is prepared to reopen it. It would challenge the stability of a verdict that many assumed was permanent. That is the explanation Charleston keeps returning to. He says the reason Marlo Mike walked into that police station was simple. He could not sleep. Imagine carrying 9 killings in silence, unable to speak about them, unable to process them publicly. Still a teenager. That pressure compounds. It does not dissolve with time. It intensifies in isolation. Charleston frames it as a breaking point, not betrayal. In his view, the confession was not weakness. It was collapse under psychological weight. He points to what he calls hypocrisy. How does someone resume public success while the minor who carried out the violence sits in permanent confinement? How do conversations about loyalty and street code continue when the youngest participant absorbed the harshest consequence? That tension has resonated with many observers because it exposes imbalance. It forces uncomfortable reflection about hierarchy and consequence. Critics respond with a different argument. They insist Marlo Mike made his own decisions. They emphasize personal responsibility. They note that he physically pulled the trigger. From that perspective, influence does not erase agency. Direction does not remove choice. The divide remains sharp. One side sees manipulation layered over immaturity. The other sees action layered over accountability. Both perspectives exist simultaneously. And now, with the possibility of cooperation emerging years after the sentence was handed down, the debate is no longer theoretical. It is becoming procedural. Because if he speaks again, if new testimony surfaces, the past does not remain static. It re-enters the present. That fact cannot be erased. Accountability exists even if the counter-argument centers on development and influence. A 15-year-old does not process risk like an adult. Neurologically, the capacity for long-term forecasting is still forming. Influence is not abstract when it comes from someone with money, status, and authority in your immediate environment. Admiration alters judgment. Power alters choice. Those forces are subtle, but they are real. Without strong guidance or alternatives, proximity to fame can feel like opportunity. When a teenager lacks structure, mentorship, or stable leadership outside the street hierarchy, outside influence grows stronger. That is not an excuse. It is context. Context does not remove responsibility, but it complicates it. It forces a broader view of how decisions are shaped, not just who made them. This case reflects a broader pattern within certain street hierarchies. Those who issue directives often remain insulated. Those who execute them carry the most exposure. Financial resources shift outcomes. Legal defense teams shift outcomes. Visibility shifts outcomes. Younger participants, especially minors, rarely have the same protection. When things collapse, the lower tier absorbs the impact first. It extends beyond one individual. The culture around violence has been commercialized. Authenticity sells. Street credibility markets well. Labels benefit from narratives rooted in danger and survival. The industry profits from stories that originate in neighborhoods where consequences are real. But profit does not extend to those who fall into prison cells or graves. The mythology remains profitable. The aftermath remains personal. There is no executive accountability when a teenager internalizes violent messaging and believes it is a path to validation. No contract clause addresses psychological fallout. No rollout plan accounts for trauma. Marlo Mike's story fits into a larger cycle. Young boys seeking respect, older figures with influence, environments that normalize retaliation, and systems that punish unevenly. Across the country, thousands of minors serve extreme sentences for actions committed before their brains were fully developed. The Supreme Court acknowledged developmental differences. It recognized that children are constitutionally distinct for sentencing purposes. Yet many remain incarcerated under older rulings or complex procedural barriers that prevent meaningful review. Reform moved forward. Relief did not always follow. Charleston's position remains direct. He believes Boosie carries moral responsibility, even if legal responsibility was never established beyond reasonable doubt. That distinction is central to his argument. Legal acquittal does not automatically resolve moral debate. He has argued that adults who influence minors into violence should advocate for their rehabilitation if those minors face life sentences. That expectation has fueled public pressure, whether Boosie chooses to engage publicly or not. The perception persists in certain circles that a debt exists. Not necessarily a legal debt, but a moral one. Advocacy, reform, support, public acknowledgement. Something. Because from the outside, the image remains stark. A teenager locked in Angola with no release date. An acquitted adult continuing his career uninterrupted. That contrast continues to drive conversation. Now, with reports suggesting Marlo Mike may reconsider his silence in hopes of relief, the stakes change again. Cooperation could reopen old wounds. It could trigger legal scrutiny. It could challenge narratives long considered closed. And if that happens, this story moves from moral debate back into active consequence. It is also possible the public does not know every detail. Cases of this scale often contain layers that never reach headlines. Court filings, procedural motions, testimony that never becomes viral clips. But perception carries weight in the court of public opinion. Silence can look like indifference when a minor receives life without parole, and the adult figure associated with the case resumes a visible career. People draw conclusions. Fair or not. That is how narrative forms. At minimum, critics argue that platforms should be used responsibly. Influence should not end at acquittal. Visibility should not erase association. Whether that expectation is realistic or not, it continues to shape how this case is remembered. And if cooperation becomes reality, memory may no longer be the only thing at stake. Advocacy for juvenile justice reform would not require an admission of guilt. Speaking about how the system handles minors, how developmental science factors into sentencing, and how cultural messaging impacts youth would signal growth. That is the expectation many observers express. If the image projected in music centers around loyalty and protection, then loyalty to those who absorbed the consequences becomes part of that discussion. Influence does not disappear when a verdict is read. It continues in what is said afterward and what is not. Because this story extends beyond two names. It reflects a broader cultural pattern. Violence is marketed as authenticity. Street involvement becomes branding. Adolescents absorb that messaging before they fully understand permanence. They see status, they see visibility. They rarely see sentencing guidelines. When tragedy follows, the same culture often responds with shock, as if the outcome was unpredictable. The cycle repeats. Young men become statistics. Prison populations expand. Careers are monetized. Meaningful change requires uncomfortable conversations. Accountability cannot stop with the person who physically commits the act. Influence matters. Encouragement matters. Adult guidance matters. And the justice system's treatment of juveniles demands scrutiny. Life without parole eliminates the possibility of growth. It assumes a teenager is permanently defined by actions committed before cognitive maturity. Marlo Mike remains in Angola, confronting the consequences of decisions made at 15. It is reasonable to assume reflection occupies his days. Long-term incarceration forces confrontation with memory. Regret likely revisits him. Replaying moments is common in extended confinement. The past cannot be altered. The future remains uncertain. Time stretches forward without guarantees. Charleston White has positioned himself as a vocal advocate. He continues to push reform arguments publicly. Whether that advocacy will translate into legal relief remains unclear. Courts, appellate processes, legislative adjustments, and executive clemency all factor into outcomes. Public pressure can influence conversation. It does not guarantee reversal. Systems move slowly, and final sentences are rarely undone without sustained effort. The central question remains unresolved. Should a person who committed violent crimes at 15 be allowed a second chance decades later? Should adults who influence minors into criminal environments carry greater responsibility, even when legal standards were not met at trial? Should cultural leaders address the impact of the messages they distribute? Those debates extend beyond this single case. They speak to how society defines redemption, accountability, and protection of youth. If cooperation from Marlo Mike becomes formal, legal systems may revisit aspects of a case long considered closed. Testimony could resurface. Allegations could be re-examined. Narratives once settled could be tested again under scrutiny. If cooperation does not materialize, the sentence stands as originally imposed. Angola remains the endpoint. Hoodleaks continues examining stories that sit at the intersection of culture, influence, and consequence. These are not comfortable discussions, but discomfort is often where reform begins. Real strength is not measured by how many conflicts someone survives. It is measured by how many young lives are redirected before they enter irreversible paths. The outcome of this story is still unfolding. Whether it ends in permanent confinement or eventual review will depend on decisions made far beyond one prison yard. And those decisions will reveal how this system ultimately defines justice for a child who became a headline.